There is a clear difference between these two poses. The one on the left is very stiff and lacks fluidity, while the one on the right has much more continuity and just overall better expresses the desired pose. And this is something that a lot of artists struggle with. Every single artist goes through that phase where they try to draw different poses and it just comes out more robotic than you anticipated. It's honestly pretty annoying, but it's fixable. So if you're an artist that has ever wondered why your figure poses don't look dynamic, then this video is for you. So the first step is identifying what even makes a pose dynamic. A ton of artists, including me, throw around the word dynamic but never really explain what it is in terms of art. So after observing some of my own drawings and looking at other people's art on Pinterest, I narrowed it down to a few key points that make a pose truly dynamic. Number one is gesture. So when I say gesture, I'm referring to the overall fluidity of the pose. In other words, it's just how put together the whole pose kind of looks. For example, does it look robotic or does it all flow together nicely? And number two is exaggeration. What I noticed from studying different art pieces is how dramatic and overly communicative all the poses were. For example, if somebody's throwing a punch, I wouldn't just draw a fist and call it a day. I try and exaggerate the punch as much as I can without it looking overly cartoony, if that makes sense. And finally, number three is emotion. Now this one kind of ties both of the other ones together. You should be able to look at a dynamic pose and easily tell what emotion it's portraying without actually looking at the face of the character. And of course, this has to do with what I talked about before. You need to make sure that your pose is expressive and cohesive at the same time. In other words, it can't look like it was put together with different puzzle pieces, but instead a complete and intentional gesture. Hey guys, if you want to learn even more about figure poses and develop the skills that make a professional artist, I have an art course with 2+ hours worth of in-depth lessons. So if you're interested at all, it'll be the first link in the description of this video, and you can also find it on all of my socials. Alright, anyways, back to the video. Okay, so now that we know what truly makes a dynamic pose, we can begin the drawing process. The first step is breaking down the figure into very simple shapes. Now, something I want to touch on is the difference between using sharp edge shapes like rectangles and boxes versus more organic ones. You see, rectangles are great for drawing more stationary poses, but for more expressive poses, they lack function and can make your character feel a bit static, or kind of robotic, how I mentioned previously. The reason for this is because these shapes use straight lines and sharp corners, which can sometimes be difficult to maneuver around, especially if you're more of a beginner artist. So when drawing dynamic poses, I recommend more organic shapes like circles and various oval shapes. To break the body down using these shapes, I typically like to use an egg-like shape for the upper torso and a wider oval shape for the lower torso. Now, of course, depending on the character, you can squish and stretch these shapes to fit their figure to your liking. The reason I prefer these shapes is because they use curved lines and are just overall easier to work with when drawing the human figure. I think we can all agree that the body is super complex and at times it can be difficult to draw. So using more rounded shapes with organic lines can definitely make the process a lot easier. And speaking of shapes, another one I'd suggest is the bean shape. Just hear me out, because I know right now you're probably wondering like, what is he talking about? Now, if you watched my previous video about torsos, you'd already know about this method, but to demonstrate, you can see that it captures the gesture of the body quite well. Typically, it's where you kind of draw this blob looking shape that has two parts to it. And I say two parts only because it kind of always folds somewhere in the middle, which, by the way, if you're using this method, kind of helps to identify where the upper and lower torso are. I personally really like using this shape because it's just easier to draw an outline rather than guessing where to put all kinds of different shapes when drawing poses. Because I'm pretty sure we've all had that one drawing experience where we try and draw with boxes or cylinders and it just literally like doesn't come out looking right. And in the end, it's just disappointing. Yeah, I really don't want to relive those days. So now that we have the general shapes down, we can move on to another trick that I think will help you guys a lot too. So if you watch really any pose tutorial on YouTube, artists will talk about what's called a line of action. And if you're not familiar with this term, it basically refers to the central line that runs from the head all the way down the spine and to the feet of whoever you're drawing. An important thing to remember is that this line can vastly change depending on the pose that your character's actually in. So for example, if my character is standing straight, then my line of action would be right through the middle of this pose, because there really just is no gesture in this pose. On the other hand, if we have a more dynamic pose like this one, I'd begin by identifying my line of action by observing how the character is kind of flowing. And by the way, typically the line of action should either be a simple S shape or a C shape, because it just really doesn't make sense if the line is like all over the place. Now after identifying this line, I can begin sketching my character carefully, making sure that it actually aligns with my line of action. You want to use it kind of as a guide to identify exactly where you want to position the different body parts. Now a lot of the time when it comes to the legs, artists will kind of get confused and not know how to position the line of action accordingly. So my advice for the lines is just to guess. Okay, that was obviously a joke, but in all seriousness, there's usually one leg that's doing more of a distinct motion in all poses, if that kind of makes sense. For example, maybe the leg is stretched out in a certain way, or maybe it's kicking somebody or something like that. In this pose, you can see that the left leg is really stretched out while the other one is kind of scrunched up. So now that you understand how to use a line of action, I want to go over how to exaggerate aspects of a pose to make it feel more dynamic. So let's say I wanted to draw a character throwing a punch. We could simply draw the character standing straight with their arm extended straight in front of them. But this is just kind of boring and doesn't really portray that emotion that we're looking for with dynamic poses. Yeah, this looks kind of boring, you can't lie. Instead, we can first identify the main points of the pose, which in this case is the fist, arm, and torso, but mainly the arm and the fist. What we can then do is exaggerate the motion of these body parts by pushing their arcs further and also stretching and squishing the forms. What this does is just creates more dynamism. Which I'm pretty sure is the right word. Dynamism? I don't know. Anyways, what this does is create more expressive movement within the main points of the pose, which gives it much more emotion and character. Your characters don't even have to be in action to do this either. Let's take a character that's simply standing upright as an example. What we can do to make this pose more intriguing is changing the tilt of the hips and shoulders to create more asymmetry in the body. Or we can also manipulate the arms, legs, and hands to be doing different things. Maybe the character is leaning to one side or has their arm bent in a different way. Nevertheless, I just want to show you guys that your character doesn't have to be doing some intense stunt to draw a dynamic pose. It can literally be something as simple as your character standing upright. So the final thing I wanted to touch on is how to use your pencil to your advantage. There have been so many times that I see artists use very rough lines that kind of don't portray the fluidity of your character. So what I wanted to highlight is using lighter and softer lines to actually draw these shapes. No matter what pose your character is in, you can use the weight of your pencil to express more emotion throughout your character's body. You can see here I'm taking my time with every stroke and I'm making sure that it looks as dynamic as possible. And the good thing about practicing figure poses is that you don't have to be super clean with your sketches since they're just a foundation for your drawings. So when you're sketching out these dynamic poses, you can be a little more carefree with your lines, making them feel more flowy if that kind of makes sense. And there's nothing wrong with using smaller and scratchier lines, but I want to emphasize the importance of line confidence. And I'll probably cover this topic a lot throughout my videos, but it's just the general idea that when you're drawing, you can actually envision and feel if the line that you're drawing is correct. But nevertheless, that's going to wrap up this lesson with how to draw figure poses. Hopefully you guys are able to take bits and pieces of this video and maybe apply it to some of your own drawings. And just as a reminder, I filmed 2 more hours of complete art lessons just to help you guys with drawing in the description if you're interested. Anyways, let me know down in the comments what videos or just any type of tutorials you guys want to see on this channel, because I'm probably going to be reading a lot of the comments for feedback. Also, feel free to check out my other socials and I'll see you guys in the next video.